Okay, so now we see what the shape of our request looks like and how to use it when we have our client. Let's actually explore more of actually bringing in the Apollo features into our application. So because we already fetched our collections, let's just go and fetch more collections. Except this time, let's fetch all of our collections and replace our collections overview with it, because that's the main place where we need access to all of the collections. Now in here, we can see that we are currently using Redux. And what we're doing is we're passing the collections into this collection component. Well, we're actually going to leverage our higher order component pattern in order to use some of the new components that we get back from Apollo. And it's going to be very similar to the consumer pattern that we saw when we used the context API the very first time. Not when we used the use context hook, but do you remember when we used the context.consumer tags? It's going to be very similar, and I'll show you how we'll use it. The first thing that we need to do is we need to remove this Redux bindings that we have on our actual collections overview. So just remove the library and remove any of this data that you don't need. And now what you need to do is you are going to make a new file inside of this collections overview. And it's going to be called collectionsoverview.container.jsx. So we did something similar before when we built our containers, but this time it's just going to be a GraphQL container. And what you're going to do is you are going to import in React from React, because what we're going to write is a new component. But we're now going to import in this new component called the query component. And this comes from React Apollo. We're also going to import in the GQL function because we need to make a GraphQL request. And we're also going to import in both our collections overview, as well as our spinner component. Okay. Now, in order for us to use this query component is going to receive the actual GraphQL query that we want to make, and then it's going to go fetch that data, and it's going to give it back to us as a function, pretty much just like the consumer when we used our context API, where it gave us a function that had access to the data that we wanted. So what we're going to do is we are going to write the actual request itself. So we're going to say const get collections and use capitals and underscores here because it's never going to change, right? So when you see the syntax, it means it is a constant. We're going to say GQL, and then you're going to use the backticks, right? Because we're doing string interpolation like we did before. And then we're going to say, with these braces, collections, and we want the ID, we want the title, we want the items, and on those items, we want the ID, we want the name, we want the price, and we want the image URL. Very similar, nothing new here. The only difference is that we had to declare it in a separate const. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to now make our new component, our collections overview container component, which is equal to this functional component that will return us back our query component, wrapping around our actual collections overview component. But before we do that, we're going to pass this query into this query itself using the query key. So we're going to say the query goes to our get collections query. And now what will happen is it will give us back a function. And on that function is going to be an object that holds actually a lot of different properties that get passed in. The main ones that we care about is the loading. So we're going to destructure these off. We're going to destructure off loading, error, and data. And we're only going to destructure off the error so that we can actually see it. But here we're going to open up these braces. And what we're going to say is we want to render the spinner if loading is true. So we're going to say if loading, right, then return from this if statement our spinner. So that's pretty much what's going to render out of this function if loading is true. So this is pretty much a Boolean. In fact, let's console log all of these so we can see what they are. So let's just wrap it in an object, right, using our object syntax so that we can know what each one is. Let's just console log the error as well as the data. And then what we'll do is we will say if loading is false. So if the data has returned back to us, then I want to return collections overview. And I want to pass in collections as data.collections. We actually have to export this and use it in order to see what happens. Now I know that collections is going to come back from data because when we made the request manually here, right, when we made this query, we knew that that was the shape that we were going to get. So if I just do ID and title, we see that we always get data with collections as the query and then the actual value of what we're getting back. So that's how I knew that it was going to be collections, because that data is pretty much just going to be this thing after the data key. So that's one thing to keep in mind for everything you get back from GraphQL. It will always be nested under the name of the query that you made. So let's export this out as the default so that we can actually see it in action. And what I'm going to show you is I'm actually going to show you a way that we can use this easier in our imports. So where do we use our collections overview? It's probably our shop page. So inside of our shop page right now, we're importing in collections overview, right, from collections overview.component. You're going to switch this over to .container, which is our new container file. And then instead of changing this, you can add the braces and say default as collections overview. And the reason you can do this is because the default is actually already aliased for you as an export with the ES6 import. So we only ever see these curly braces in our import statements when we make non-default imports. Well, it turns out we actually have also access to this default alias, which is always exported for us, even when we export out something by default. So we can say, I want to import in whatever gets exported by default from this file as collections overview, right? So I want to set it as this constant name. So now we don't have to change it for anywhere we used it. And it's easy for us to know where it is because we just know that what's it being imported is by default this collections overview. So now if I save, if I go back to my application, and if I go to the shop, what will load is our collections overview. And you'll see that the object is loading true. The object here, right, that we actually have as our error is undefined. If we actually had an error, we would get the error object. So we can do something with that if we had, say, a component that handled error states. But in our case, we don't. We also got our data object, which initially was empty. So the first time this logged, there was no data. That's why loading was true. And that's why we load our spinner. Now, the moment that loading is false, that means that we actually get the data we needed back. And the data is the object with, again, the query that we made, which was collections. And then it gives us back the array of the collections objects that we needed. And as we see, our shop overview page works the same as it did before. But now, of course, none of these buttons, they're still synced up to Redux, but we have to switch this over to using Apollo. But we've made our first query. We've made our first request to get all of our collection items. And it was pretty simple. It wasn't that complicated, right? And we were mainly able to continue using our components the same way that we did before. We mainly were using a map state to props higher order component pattern with our Redux bindings. And now we're simply just wrapping over our presentational collections overview component with this new container that does the fetching for us, and then it'll pass the data into our collections overview component. So it's actually really handy, especially with this method of error handling. We don't have to worry about setting our loading state, our is fetching is true, right, when our request starts, and then we got to set it to false when our request succeeds. All of this gets handled for us by the Apollo client, which is a beautiful thing. It's so easy to use for this reason. In fact, our spinner component is so simple. It's just a component now, right? We don't have to worry about any of the patterns with higher order components, anything like that. So that's one of the big benefits of using this pattern and using the Apollo client. So now that we've rendered our collection page, let's use another query and let's modify our specific individual collection page. And I'll show you how to do that in the next lesson.